Hello and welcome to a very special How I Paint Things. Now, real quick question answered right now. Can you Slapchop a hero? Yes. And I'm going to show you with some CITADEL contrast and the new Vallejo Xpress line. But I do want to talk very quickly about the miniature that's spinning around in front of me here. That little dog is real, and he is the dog that belongs to the team the sculptors at Reptilian Overlords. Now, little Pippin, he recently had an awful accident. They're not entirely sure what happened, but he lost an eye. As you can see on the miniature there, he doesn't have a bionic eye in reality, unfortunately. And he pulled through, quite a serious little incident, but he's going to need a lot of ongoing care. Vet costs, antibiotics, that sort of stuff, they aren't free and they aren't always cheap. So this fella here, he is a donation miniature. You can cruise along to Reptilian Overlords, and I will pop the link in the description for this fella. And, as little as $1, he is literally a pay-what-you-want miniature. And anything that you pay will go towards Pippin's ongoing care. So, while I'm not normally one who likes to pick one charity over another, animals, I don't like that animals can't tell us, what's wrong, and we can't really convince them that everything's going to be okay. So anytime there's an opportunity to help out, I'm on the side of the little furry fellas. So all of the paints for this one will be listed in the description below, same as always. Let's get started. So once you've printed him and cleaned him off, the first thing to do is to prime this fella. But I want to quickly touch on the fact that I haven't actually stuck him to a base yet. What I've done is to drill into the rock and a little way into his foot, and I've put him on a tiny wee bit of pin, which I've then jammed into the cork. Reason being, I can swivel him around here and reach up under his jacket much more easily like this. It's not strictly necessary. If I weren't being a fusspot, I would probably skip that step, but I want to make sure that I do get a little bit of everything with this. So I've primed him with the Army Painter's Matte Black, and it does not matter at all what black primer you use. For the purposes of this method, black is black is black. Now we're going to Slapchop him, and as much as I still think it's a very silly name, it does me no good to whine about it because folks tend to understand now what it is you're talking about when you mention the Slapchop method. So that's what we're going to do. I'm going to start here with Stone Golem from the Army Painter. Get a little bit of this onto my makeup brush, big soft dry brush, and kind of wiggle it across a bit of card. I don't want to take much off. At this point, rather than dry brushing, we're really over brushing. And what we want to do is more or less make this guy entirely gray, leaving just the black in the recesses, which might seem a little counterproductive being as though he's going to be a black commissar, but you'll see why. The idea here is that we want to leave the very recesses black because it's going to leave sort of a black line effect around our miniature. So you'll need to go around a couple of times to build up the color. And don't worry if it is just a little bit chalky. Now after 2 or 3 passes, what we'll have is something like this. And you'll see it's a little bit different to simply priming him in gray because we still have these little bits of black detailing right at the edges of areas of detail, which is super useful. But for the skin and for little Pippin there, what I have is some Wraithbone. And I'm actually going to be fairly generous in applying this. I want to basically base coat those areas so they're a lot lighter and a little more solid, because when we put our skin tones and Pippin's little fur, oh look at him, Pippin's fur color will look much better over Wraithbone. So just jab this in there, not being too careful with it at all. Now at the moment, all that's going to do is make him look quite sick, but I swear the difference on that is going to be really pronounced when we apply our colors over the top of that. What we'll do now is to finish off the Slapchop effect, and what we need is a white paint. I'm using here matte white from the Army Painter, and same thing again, just a big old makeup brush. What we'll do this time is concentrate, we're bringing the brush down to highlight really the edges and the upper creases and what have you on this dude's jacket. Bolt gun as well, and don't worry, you're going to go straight over his face, and little Pippin there too. So this time it's a lot more like a traditional dry brush where we're really just catching edges, so that when we pop our shades, our contrast and what have you over the top, what we'll get is a much more pronounced shading effect at the edges, which will look really cool. Now there is the basis of the Slapchop method. You'll see particularly on some of the flatter areas of his jacket, what I've actually done, particularly you'll see here, is to stipple a little bit of white and deliberately create a high point that is going to stand out a little bit more when we shade it with the contrast or whatever we use over the top. All in all, that's pretty easy to do. If you do want a more pronounced version, what you could do would be to use a darker mid-tone, but I think this is going to work quite well for what I've got in mind. Now we'll start, much as we would with any miniature painting, we're going to start from the bottom up, and that means with his skin. Now this fella I am using here, this is Dwarf Flesh from the Vallejo Xpress color line, and it is a little bit darker than Golem Flesh when it dries. I quite like how it goes on as well. So I'm going to go over his hair with this too. Now dwarf skin can be quite daunting because it goes on looking super orange. But once it's gone over the top and dried on our Wraithbone, we've got a really cool base color for skin tone. Now I am going to highlight this, but if you didn't want to, if you just want to smash through it really quickly, start from a pure white. Instead of doing the Wraithbone, just painting his face completely white. I'm going to swap now to Skeleton Horde, and this is a contrast color. Bones and greys are a couple of the things currently missing from the Vallejo Xpress range, but they've already said more are coming. So we'll paint over Pippin's fur. Make sure to spend a second getting it into all the little fuzzy bits. Now on his front, the real little dog has got a white sort of face and belly. So I'm going to come back once this is dry and we'll paint those details in with a little bit of acrylic. But for now, let's just cover him over. God, he's cute. Let's cover him over with Skeleton Horde. Now I'm going to paint some of the black details on him using different black contrast and express colors because I want to show the differences between them. So what I have is black Templar. Now this, when it came along, it was clearly not a true black. There's a little bit of blue in this. But I'm going to paint his trousers in this quite quickly. I've also painted in his belt and a little bit of his hat. And yeah, that's not looking too bad. What I'm going to do now is paint in all of his jacket with Black Lotus. And here you're going to see a big difference between these two colors. So I'm going to start up around his collar. As soon as this goes on and starts drying a little, you'll see it's really a dark, almost petrol kind of color, which works super well for leather, I say. You'll also see in the background that I am using a wet palette. Now, the Army Painter speed paints, they recommend don't use a wet palette because it will upset the method. The goop that's in there will dry a little funky, whereas I haven't found that to be the case with the Xpress line. Now, by comparison, I am also keeping my wet palette quite dry, so it's a dry wet palette. So the thinning effects that might crop up aren't all that prevalent. So I'm going to start with a nice small brush, slowly do the quite detailed parts, and then I'm going to swap to a larger brush and fill in his legs and tummy. Now to my eye, that is such a nice black blue. It is a little bit more blue than some might like. I am going to show you how to delve that down a little bit later on, but for now, yeah, man, that goes on so smooth, and it's such a nice... Yeah, it just works for me. I think that's gorgeous. But now what I'm going to apply is some Nazdreg yellow, and we're going to put this over the bits of his uniform, which are going to be a little bit brighter later on. Now, if you don't want to highlight these, you could use Iyanden yellow instead, but I do want to do a little bit of work to these later on. So, sticking to the purely Slapchop method, I would probably have a brighter color here, but this is going to lighten up a little bit as it dries anyhow. Now I've done that now because if I need to, what I could do would be to tidy up his cuffs with a little bit of white. But luckily I don't need to, I was quite careful. What I have here is Velvet Red, and this is from Vallejo. This is very similar to Blood Angel's Red, A little bit darker maybe, but not as meaty as Flesh Tearer's red is. And now I'm going to use Black Legion and paint in just a couple of the areas that I want to be a super solid black. So you'll see even up against the areas here where I've done the Black Lotus and the Black Templar, you can see how much closer this is to a true flat acrylic. So as well as his scabbard and the peak of his hat, I did his hair and Pippin's little nose. Pippin's nose is a really dark brown, but black I think is going to work better on the miniature. Now I've got some Basilicanum grey, and I'm just going to quickly toss this over the rock. And while that dries, a little Flesh Tearer's red on the grip of his sword. You could do this any colour you fancied. I'm just going with red because it's going to sort of fit the motif we've got so far. Now we're going to start applying a couple of metallic paints. Here I'm going to use Iron Hand Steel for all of the, well, steel parts. You could paint his chest piece in as being like black or something, but I like the big shining chest piece look on these guys. I think it just suits them. Now what I'm going to apply, this is the new Vallejo Game Color Black Wash. And this, oh my goodness, this is the business. You could use dark tone here instead from the Army Painter. It'll also work very well. Now, I just really like how this one settles. It's got such a nice sort of flow quality to it. It's really pleasant to use. So over all of that metal we've just painted, a quick blast of black wash. And I was thinking at first about applying this all over his coat, but I've really come to like that blue-black finish. So instead what I'm going to apply this over is his boots to dull those down a little bit and make them look just a slightly different shade of black to his coat. And once that has dried, I'm going to use the same steps to lay down the base coats for the gold. So we'll start with some Retributor armor on all of the gold details. Now depending on the finish that you want for the gold is going to change which wash you use on it. If you want a warm, nice, well cared for gold, then a little bit of flesh wash, weirdly enough, is normally a pretty good shade for that. So I'm going to go over his hat and his sword with this. And before I shade the one on his chest, I'll use some Karak stone to paint in the little scroll work that's just underneath it, because I'll shade those two with the same color. And that color is going to be the Umber Wash, the new one from Vallejo. Now this is going to give you a much darker, more coppery kind of finish to your gold, but I quite like it. Pop that over your scroll work as well, and also make sure, just pop a little bit of this over the rock that he's standing on to make it look a little more natural than just straight grey. Now while that dries, I'm going to get a fresh spot of white and just dot in Pippin's little eye. And I'm also going to paint in the what do you call it, the ribbon on the chest here. Then I'm going to make his eye glow with just a tiny wee splash of Aethermatic blue. And then, quite genuinely because of no other reason than I haven't used it yet, I've got here Storm Blue, which is one of the Vallejo Xpress colours. I'm just going to paint a little line down the centre of the award there. Now, when it comes to highlights, I'm actually not going to do very many because I do quite like how he's turned out so far. Now, I did just try some Kislev flesh, but it actually wasn't all that different from the shading that had been left behind by the Xpress colour. So instead, I'm going to go up to Flayed One flesh and carefully this time, just do a few little dabs of this to accentuate the shape of his face. While I'm highlighting faces, Pippin himself actually has quite a light little face and tummy. So what I'm going to do is go back to some fresh Wraithbone, just make sure there's not too much on my brush there, and just dabbing around some of those areas to lighten them up a little bit. Now for any bits of yellow braiding or what have you that you want to highlight, a tiny wee bit of Ushabti bone is going to do the job. Now mind how you go with this, because it will very quickly overpower this stuff. But a little of it just to tighten up some of those edges will look great. Now my last two highlights I'm going to do after I varnish him, because this is quite a matte varnish. This is the Instar Varnish Plus. And I want my metallic highlights to stay quite shiny. So I'm going to varnish them first. And then those metallic highlights are going to be some Liberator Gold, and I'll let you guess where that's going. And then for the silver details, what I have is Model Air Metallic Steel from Vallejo. You can use here Stormhost Silver, but I tend to find that this is just a little bit sharper and will flow off the brush a little bit easier. Now, it's also worth pointing out that with a really sharp steel silvery color like this, you don't need to stop at highlighting your metal. What you can also do is to actually highlight some of the gold with it. If you want a really burnished finish, let's get that in shot. What you can do is just tiny little touches of this right at the edges of any gold that you want to accentuate. And there at last, Nomisar Cheese and his little dog Pippin are complete. Now, I had a ton of fun painting this guy, and it was really quite interesting to have a shot at the Slapchop method using the Vallejo Xpress paints, because they are slightly less opaque than contrast and I assume speed paints, but that does let your the colors underneath show through a little bit better. Particularly on his face, I would have been quite happy to leave that as it was without any highlighting. You could go ahead and highlight his jacket here, maybe with Fenrisian Grey or something similar, but I don't really think you'd need to. I quite like that blue-black finish. It's got a real 1998 kind of finish about it, and yeah, I'm really happy with that. He's gonna take part in my battles. I'm gonna pop him down with my army. What a cool miniature. So if you do have the opportunity and you want to help out little Pippin with his ongoing care, cruise along to the link in the description. Like I said, you don't need a printer. You can just pop in a couple of dollars if you want to say good luck to the poor wee mite. As always, thank you very much to Exit 23 Games for the light and sound equipment, and all of the wonderful patrons who are keeping me in paints and glue, including my producers Alan Nuttall, Kyrie Crawford, Rod, Andrew, and Jimmy. Your support means the world, folks. Any questions or anything, feel free to drop them in the old comment box below. My Twitter and Instagram are both linked there too. So thank you very much for your time, one and all, and you all enjoy the rest of your day.